Okay, picture this. The Berlin Wall just crumbling down. Not some planned thing, but people just like surging through it. It's such a powerful image, you know?
Yeah, totally. But behind that, there's a whole chain of events, each with its own story. And that's what we're looking at today, the revolutions of '89 in Eastern Europe, and how they basically ended the Cold War.
Right. And we've got all this material that goes deep into what caused them, how fast they happened, and what they mean even now. So what we want to do is get you past the headlines to really get what drove these changes, how different they were in each country, and how they changed the world for good.
It's a complicated story. So to understand 1989, we need to see where these revolutions came from, the situation before.
Yeah, okay. So after World War II, Europe was divided for decades, right? You had the Cold War, the Soviet Union controlling all these Eastern European countries, like East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria, all communist, all looking to Moscow.
Exactly. Churchill called it the Iron Curtain, and he wasn't kidding. It was a real division. And what kept it that way was something called the Brezhnev Doctrine. It basically said the Soviets could use their military anywhere in these countries if they thought communism was threatened. Think of Hungary in '56, Czechoslovakia in '68. The message was clear. Stay in line, or the tanks roll in. This, of course, went against the whole idea of countries being able to run themselves without someone else butting in.
So basically, any big challenge to the communists was shut down by the fear of Soviet tanks. So what changed? This is where it gets interesting. Gorbachev coming to power in the USSR.
Right, that was huge. Gorbachev saw the Soviet Union was in trouble, the economy was terrible, nothing new was happening. So he tried two things. Glasnost being more open, allowing more freedom of speech, and perestroika restructuring the economy, trying to make it work.
And even though he was focused on fixing the Soviet Union, these reforms had a big impact on Eastern Europe, right?
Yeah.
Not always in ways he planned, I bet.
Totally. The biggest thing was Gorbachev basically ditching the Brezhnev Doctrine. He said, no more sending in tanks to save communist governments in Eastern Europe. This is a seismic shift, For the first time in ages, these countries could think about change without the Soviets immediately crushing them.
It's like a mental barrier was removed. And with that, change started happening. First big example, Poland and the Solidarity movement.
Right. Poland was leading the way in challenging communism. Solidarity, led by Lech Walesa, was a big deal in the early '80s, fighting for workers' rights and democracy. It got crushed, but the desire for change and how Solidarity was organized, that remained.
And then, in '89, you get the roundtable talks. What made those so important?
Well, it was a big step back by the Polish communists. They were under pressure, people were unhappy, the economy was a mess, and Moscow wasn't backing them up like before. So they agreed to talk to Solidarity. The result. They agreed to semi-free elections, almost unheard of in the Eastern Bloc then. And Solidarity won those elections, big time. They made Tadeusz Mazowiecki prime minister, the first non-communist in decades. This shocked everyone. It showed that moving away from communism wasn't just talk, it could actually happen.
It set a precedent that other countries were definitely paying attention to. Okay, so then we go to Hungary. What was going on there?
Hungary was already trying some reforms, even before the Polish elections. They were dismantling bits of the communist system, called themselves a republic, and allowed some opposition parties. But the biggest thing, symbolically and practically, was opening their border with Austria in May '89.
Wait, so they just opened the border, a part of the Iron Curtain, just like that?
Yep. Officially, it was to let Hungarians travel more freely. But what it really did was let East Germans, who wanted to get to the West, escape. They'd go to Hungary and then just cross into Austria. It was a huge hole in the Iron Curtain. Thousands of East Germans went through it, putting tons of pressure on their government, who couldn't stop them. This simple act showed how weak the East German state was. They couldn't even keep their people in. It wasn't just a physical opening. It was a psychological one, too, showing the Iron Curtain wasn't so strong after all.
So all these East Germans leaving through Hungary really turned up the heat inside East Germany itself. And that leads us straight to the Berlin Wall coming down on November 9th, '89, the event that everyone remembers, the symbol of this whole period of change.
The pressure had been building for months. Protests in Leipzig, Berlin, people demanding change, freedom to travel, the end of the communist regime. The government was losing control, and the wall falling. In a way, it was a mistake. Some official on live TV said travel restrictions were lifted right then.
You're kidding. Something that big started by accident.
It seems crazy, but that's kind of how it happened. No one said, go open the wall. But people heard the news and rushed to the crossings. The guards were caught off guard, no orders, so they just opened the gates. It was this amazing, unplanned moment, people breaking down this symbol of division. And with the wall gone, the whole Cold War idea seemed to fall apart even more.
A really pivotal moment.
Hmm.
After that, change just kept rolling across the region. Let's look at Czechoslovakia and what they called the Velvet Revolution.
Yeah, what's amazing about Czechoslovakia is how peaceful it was. Seeing what was happening elsewhere, people started protesting in November '89, led by people like Václav Havel and the Civic Forum. It started with students, intellectuals, really well organized, and quickly got tons of support. The communist government was losing its grip, people didn't see them as legitimate anymore, and the Velvet part wasn't just about no violence, it was also how organized and unified the opposition was. These were intellectuals, artists, who had a clear idea of a democratic future.
And the government's response was pretty mild, right?
Yeah, especially compared to some others. They were under so much pressure and Moscow wasn't going to help them anymore, so the whole government just resigned in December '89. Power changed hands smoothly, no violence, hence Velvet Revolution. Václav Havel, a dissident, a writer, became president. It was a victory for power over authoritarianism.
A great example of peaceful, organized resistance working. But it wasn't all peaceful, right? Romania is a sad exception.
Unfortunately, yes. Romania's revolution was violent and tragic. Protests started in Timisoara because the government tried to silence a priest who disagreed with them. It spread fast to Bucharest, the capital. And Ceausescu's regime, they went all in, attacking unarmed protesters. A lot of people died.
And that backfired, didn't it? It only made people more angry and determined.
Absolutely. The violence made people even angrier and led to the military switching sides, which is a turning point. On Christmas Day in 1989, things moved really fast. Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife Elena were captured, put on trial quickly, and executed. It was brutal, a sudden end to one of the worst dictatorships in Europe, totally different from the mostly peaceful changes in other places.
Okay, so we've seen all these revolutions, each with its own story.
Yeah.
But how did this all end the Cold War? It feels like dominoes falling, one after another.
That's a good way to put it. One revolution gave courage to others. Poland showed it was possible. Hungary opened the border, showed a weakness. The Berlin Wall falling, that was the symbol of the whole Soviet bloc crumbling.
And these changes inside the Eastern Bloc, they changed the whole world, right?
Totally. Communist regimes falling led to the Warsaw Pact, their military alliance, dissolving in '91. No communist governments, no need for the pact. Then, Germany reunified in 1990, a huge event, ending a major Cold War division and shifting power in Europe. And the biggest thing, long-term, losing control of Eastern Europe, plus problems at home made worse by Gorbachev's reforms, all that made dissent grow inside the Soviet Union, and it fell apart in '91.
Wow. So in just a few years, the whole world order that had existed for decades was gone. The U.S. was the only superpower left. It's amazing how fast everything changed.
It really is. But to understand how it happened, we need to look deeper at the root causes and the different ways these revolutions worked. Our second source has a lot of good info on this.
Right. So besides Gorbachev opening the door, what else was going on in Eastern Europe that made this possible?
One big thing was their economies. They were stagnant, stuck. These communist economies couldn't keep up with the West in technology, productivity, making things people wanted. This made people lose faith in the communist governments, and there was a lot of discontent. We also can't forget the Helsinki Accords from '75. These were agreements signed by a bunch of European countries, including the Eastern Bloc, about security and human rights. Back then, they seemed like just diplomacy. But the human rights part gave opposition groups something to point to, a way to talk about their demands and challenge the government. And technology played a role too, you know.
Fax machines, satellite TV, those things. How did those change politics?
Well, they helped people get around the government's control of information. Dissidents used fax machines to share info and organize secretly. Satellite TV showed people what was happening in the West, which was often very different from what their own state-controlled media was saying.
So all these underlying problems were there, waiting to explode. What actually set off the revolutions in '89?
The source gives a few examples. Environmental problems got people active in places like Lithuania and Bulgaria, even before the bigger push for political change. The Chernobyl disaster in '86 was huge, too. It showed that these regimes weren't competent and weren't honest with people. Also, nationalist feelings, which had been suppressed, became a powerful force, especially in the Baltic states and Yugoslavia. And of course, everyday life was hard shortages, prices going up, people were angry and felt the system was broken. Even small things like a student protest in Czechoslovakia could trigger a bigger movement when people were already unhappy.
It shows how a small event can have a huge impact when people are already fed up and the government is weak. And these revolutions were mostly non-violent, except for Romania. What tactics did they use that worked so well?
Big public demonstrations were key. Seeing so many people in the streets showed the regimes they had lost support. Symbolic protests, like waving national flags, using national symbols, reminded people of their shared identity and made the communist ideology seem less important. Civil disobedience, like strikes and boycotts, disrupted the state and put economic pressure on them. And something less obvious but important was getting people within the regime, like military or government officials, to switch sides or at least not stop the protests. And lastly, getting support from Western countries and international groups gave the opposition credibility and put pressure on the regimes.
It's fascinating how these different nonviolent tactics worked so well in so many places. Now, our second source says these revolutions didn't all have the same results. It wasn't like a cookie cutter, was it?
No, not at all. The Baltic singing revolution in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania was unique. They used their national songs to mobilize people and eventually break away from the Soviet Union. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution, as we discussed, shows how being organized and committed to nonviolence can lead to a smooth transfer of power. And Poland's Solidarity, which kept going for years despite being suppressed, shows how a strong civil society can eventually force change.
And then you have the sadder cases, like Romania.
Right. Romania's violent revolution got rid of a terrible dictator, but their transition to democracy was harder, and former communists still had a lot of power. Bulgaria had a gentle revolution where the Communist Party changed leaders, but real democratic reforms were slow. And East Germany was a special case. They basically merged with West Germany, driven by people's desire and geopolitics.
And then there's Yugoslavia, which went in a completely different and terrible direction.
Yes, Yugoslavia shows that the end of communism didn't mean peace and democracy everywhere. Nationalism and ethnic tensions exploded when the central government weakened, leading to violence and war. It's a reminder that these transitions are fragile, and ethnic and national issues have to be dealt with carefully and fairly.
So looking back at 1989, it's clear it was a mix of long-term problems and events that set things off. But ultimately, it shows that people have the power to change even the strongest regimes.
That's right. What does this mean for us today? It shows that even systems that seem strong can collapse if people don't support them. It also shows that change happens because of things inside a country: bad economy, desire for freedom, organized people, and things outside shifts in global power, the flow of information.
And it's important to remember that each country's experience was different. Some were peaceful, some violent, some successful, some tragic. There was no single recipe for revolution or building a democracy.
Exactly. The legacy of 1989 is complicated, with inspiring stories and warnings about the challenges of change.
So, thinking about all this, what do you think are some signs that similar changes might be happening in other parts of the world today? And how do you think technology like the internet and social media is affecting these movements compared to the simpler technology of back then? It's a question we're thinking about as we watch how the world is changing.